This Sunday, we are very excited to have a guest speaker. Dr. Gushee is a pastor, professor, author, and probably a lot of other things that he is going to be speaking to us this morning, and we're just very honored to have him here. So, Dr. Gushee, if you will come up, I'm very excited about what he teased it out for us last night. It's going to be really good.
Thanks, Melody. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Get myself set up here. It has been a delight to be with you all over the last 12 hours or so. And I met Melody in Nolens, at a conference of essentially Vineyard and Post-Vineyard church pastors mainly. And we struck up a fast friendship, and now I am glad to be hanging out with you guys. Does this sound good? Is it a little echoey? Is it okay? Okay. Here's the main text I want to read this morning, but there'll be others as well. This sermon or talk is called a Post-Evangelical reading of Job. And here's the opening text, Job 31, 5 through 8. If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hurried to deceit, let me be weighed in a just balance. Let God know my integrity. If my step has turned aside from the way and my heart has followed my eyes, and if any spot has clung to my hands, then let me sow and another eat, and let what grows for me be rooted out. So we're going to hang out with Job this morning. Few books of the Bible are as disturbing to the casual reader and sometimes the not-so-casual reader as the book of Job. An innocent man, the very best of men, has his children, his prosperity, and his health taken from him, supposedly on the basis of what can only be described as a disturbing wager between God and the Satan. Job loses everything and he grieves, but he doesn't just grieve, he begins questioning God's justice. His three so-called comforters quickly turn on him when he will not accept their interpretation of what has happened, which is that he must have done something bad to have merited this judgment. Job stands alone in standing against their interpretation and standing up for his own integrity. They reach a stalemate. A young whippersnapper named Elihu shows up in chapter 32, and he thinks he offers something decisive and nobody cares. So that's at the end of Elihu. God appears in the next chapter, and basically he takes Job on a tour of creation and says, hey, were you there when I made this? Job gets very quiet. God restores Job's blessing, happy ending, kind of. When I told my 30-year-old daughter that I was about to write a sermon about Job, she said quite decisively, what a terrible book. Only religious people like the book of Job. My daughter Maria is a non-church-going post-evangelical. She's half right. Only religious people like the book of Job as it is normally interpreted, because only religious people will defend anything and everything if they believe it is what the Bible says. I believe actually that the book of Job itself offers the single best counterpoint to the traditional way of reading the Bible, including the book of Job. So I'm going to put Job against Job against the traditional way of reading Job. I want to offer a post-evangelical reading of Job. It's based on several dozen commentaries. I'm writing a book about Job right now. I think it shows not only that the Bible can still speak to post-evangelicals, but that at least here we're in a very good position to read and understand it in some new ways. So let's try it. I'm going to suggest, I think it's 7 steps. So the first step, the central character of this story must be a suffering innocent. That's the whole presupposition. The book of Job was written to challenge a theological belief that was highly visible in the Old Testament, that it was also highly visible in the ancient Near East, that is mentioned in the New Testament, and that survives to this day. That belief is God has set up a world that is so just that good people flourish and bad people suffer. Social psychologists, even today, call this the just world hypothesis. Just world hypothesis. Or if they are feeling a little bit snarky, they call it the just world fallacy. The just world hypothesis shows up in the Hebrew Bible, and it takes there either a divine interventionist form or a wisdom form. And what I mean is, the divine interventionist form, which we find in the book of Deuteronomy and much of the rest of the historical books, goes like this. God chose Israel, and God blesses Israel when they obey him, and God punishes Israel when they disobey. And that interpretation of Israel's history runs throughout much of the Hebrew Bible, right? The wisdom version is more subtle, but in the end similar. This is the notion that God has set up a just world, and that the implication of this setup is that good people who make wise choices are rewarded, bad people who make bad choices are punished. Bad stuff happens to them, basically, naturally. So in a Deuteronomy reading, God intervenes to punish the bad, and in a wisdom reading, the bad consequences of people's actions just kind of fall upon their own heads, right? Either way, the world is viewed reassuringly as being just, with a just God at the head of it as creator and as judge. The problem is that life does not always conform to this vision. Children get cancer. The meanest man in town becomes the mayor. Nations that are trying to please God get annihilated by evil enemies. While one can sometimes see good people flourishing and bad people reaping bad consequences, it doesn't always go that way. Shall we share examples, or shall we just assume that this is what we see, right? Okay. Many scholars believe that the occasion for the writing of this particular book, relatively late in the writing of the Bible, was one unjust catastrophe too many. Either for the author, maybe a personal tragedy for the author, or for the people that produced the author. Someone needed to challenge the reassuring but not quite persuasive just world hypothesis. And the brilliant author of the book of Job did that. To do it, the author needed to tell a story. Actually, there was an old story in circulation that he was able, or she was able, to borrow. And all you really needed was a sentence that went like this: once upon a time, the most respected, most just, most blessed man in town lost everything and began questioning God. The book of Job could have begun that way. But the author or editor decided that the story should not begin there. A backstory was needed. The backstory is in Job 1 and 2. And this is where we get the very disturbing story of the Satan, the accuser, suggesting to God that Job's faith and virtue were on account of him being so blessed. So that if God took away his blessings, Job's faith and virtue would collapse. God is essentially tricked into ruining Job's life, and we're off and running. This is a very disturbing prequel. I want to propose, rather cheekishly or whatever, that this can be detached from the main story. The Satan is never mentioned again in the book of Job. The wager is never mentioned again, and Job never learns of it. The rest of the book of Job functions perfectly well without it. What we need is an innocent sufferer, and by Job 2:13 we have him. A man who feared God and turned away from evil, the richest and most honored man in the entire East, the man who had everything until it was all taken away from him. The only family member he had left was his grief-stricken, angry wife. Remember her? Whose suggestion to Job is that he should curse God and die. By the way, there's a first century retelling of the book of Job in the Jewish community where she gets a name and her story is told a little bit more. And her grief is made more clear. She was grief-stricken too, right? So step 2. So step 1 is you need an innocent sufferer, and we got him. Step 2, Job's friends arrive to offer him just world theology. Okay? Job has 3 friends that come to comfort him. They are infamous: Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar. Their best moment is their first one, when they find their friend sitting among the ashes on the ground with his head shaved, covered with boils, and all of his children dead. In reading the commentaries, it appears that he is either sitting on like a dung heap or at the town dump. He's ruined. And they sit with him for a week in silence. They were never better. After that, it goes bad, right? But then Job, after a week of silence, begins to find his voice at last, but it's a new voice now. On the other side of unspeakable loss, he begins with an extraordinarily intense lament, wishing that his parents essentially had never met so that he would never have been born. And then by chapter 6, he's saying, all I want is to die, and God won't even let me die. His friends are shocked by Job's new voice, and they immediately begin to remind him that there already is a theological answer for his situation. The world is just, the wicked are the ones who suffer, so Job must have sinned. The friends offer Job just world theology. This effort begins with Eliphaz in chapter 4, and it never really stops. Okay, so you have an innocent sufferer who has friends, but the friends offer him just world theology. That's 2 steps. Third step, Job's lacerating experience makes that theology impossible for him now. Already by chapter 6, Job is challenging his friends to move off their formulas and deal with him. With him. I hadn't noticed this before, but listen to this. This is in Job 6. But now be pleased to look at me. Look at me. For I will not lie to your face. Turn, I pray, let no wrong be done. Look at me, Job says to his friends. Look at me. Me here with these boils all over me. Me here with my head shaved. Me here with all my children dead. Me here with all my prosperity taken away. Look at me. Engage me right now. Can you truly say that I have done wrong enough to merit this? You may need that formula to make sense of your world, but can you look me in the eyes and consider my life and say that to me? That's what Job is saying. Job does not have new theological answers yet, but what he does know is this: the old theology does not work for him anymore. Is this ringing any bells? The old theology does not work for him anymore. As he looks around, he sees the world through new eyes. One thing he notices is that a lot of other people experience cruel injustice. By chapter 7, he's mentioning day laborers and enslaved people. He says, do not human beings have a hard service on earth, and are not their days like the days of a laborer, like a slave who longs for the shadow, and like laborers who look for their wages? So I am allotted months of emptiness and nights of misery. Remember that Job had been the greatest one in the East. He had massive material prosperity, but now Job has lost it all, and he's identifying for the first time with servants and laborers. This is perhaps the beginning of something for Job, something good. I want to come back to that later. What if we understand Job before to have been the kind of person who would have responded to other people's suffering with just world theology? After all, his very life embodied its premises from his perspective. He was the greatest, wealthiest, most honored man in the entire region, also acknowledged to be blameless and upright and devout, a person of unimpeachable integrity. He had it all. And one of the things that he had was what we might dress up and call epistemological certainty about the old-time religion. In other words, he knew it was true. That religion that says the good are rewarded and the wicked are punished. Why would he not believe that? It made sense to him of his own life. But now, having lost every blessing once attributed to his virtue and his faith, he now defends his virtue but abandons the faith. He still believes in God, but he can't any longer believe in the complacent story that the good are always rewarded and the wicked are always the ones who suffer. His experience has made it impossible. He can't go back. Have you ever reached a place where the old theology, you can't go back? You can't go back. So, an innocent sufferer has been confronted with just world theology and has said, I cannot buy it anymore. Step 4. Job's suffering now includes his loss of certainty. his loss of theological certainty. By Job 9, it seems clear that Job is suffering partly because he doesn't know what to make of the world or God anymore. He says, "How could a mortal be just before God? If one wished to contend with him, one could not answer him." Job will continue to assert that he is a morally innocent person, but now he's no longer sure that anybody is considered innocent by God. He's also pretty clear that if God has done this to him, there's nobody he can appeal to for help. You know, when you're looking for help, you usually pray to God, but if God is the one who's attacking him, how do you pray to the one who's attacking you? God can't be his defender, his mediator, or his helper if God is the one who is ruining his life. Job begins to wonder whether God is just pure power, arbitrary power, against which a target like him doesn't stand a chance. The whole presupposition of the theology that he had inherited is that God is both all-powerful and all-good. But what if God is powerful but not good? This is where Job is heading. But there's another step, step 5. Job's suffering expands to include him being rejected by his community. By chapter 12, Job is experiencing a broad social rejection. He says this, "No doubt you are the people and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I'm not inferior to you." He goes on to say, "I am a laughingstock to my friends. I who called upon God and he answered me, I am a laughingstock. Those at ease have contempt for my misfortune." I picture that by chapter 12, a crowd of people has gathered. It's not just Job and 3 friends, it's the entire community gathered around. Can you picture them? In this village or wherever? By now, the whole community is there, and by now, Job's, not just his suffering, but his unwillingness to surrender to the old theology has made him a laughingstock. People are laughing at the one they once most honored. He uses that word twice, laughingstock. The community is weary of his complaints, weary of his lack of willingness to give them the interpretation that he wants, and now they're laughing at him. Actually, by chapter 15, it gets worse. Job is accused of undermining religion. People who are accused of undermining religion sometimes end up in serious trouble in old communities. That's what Socrates was accused of. He ended up drinking the hemlock and dying. Job says this, or his enemy says this, "Job, you are doing away with the fear of God and hindering meditation before God. You must be stopped." Job is now the theological enemy of the people. He chalks it up to their difference in experience, and maybe he's reflecting on his old self when he says, "I also could talk as you do if you were in my place. I could join words together against you and shake my head at you. But the thing is, you're not in my place, and I'm not in your place, and you don't understand what I'm dealing with." Step 6. Job reaffirms his integrity. This is where I see Job as a heroic figure. Though he is being, what he says is, attacked by God, laughed at by his neighbors, judged a threat to religion in the community, though he says, "My friends scorn me and my eyes pour out tears to God," Job will not give anyone what they are wanting from him. What they want from him is a confession of his sin and a reaffirmation of the old theology, and he won't give it to them, even though he stands alone. Nearing the end of his dialogue with his friends in chapter 27, Job makes a bitter sacred vow before the God who has hurt him. He says this, "As God lives, who has taken away my right, and the Almighty who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, my lips will not speak falsehood, my tongue will not utter deceit. Far be it from me to say that you are right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. You will not get from me what you want, because I will not lie for you." In chapter 31, he details the way of life he had sought to live when he had everything, when he had the biggest house, the biggest yard, the most workers, the most property. when he was the richest man in town, he said, and this is Job 31. I once preached a sermon on this at Union University in West Tennessee. I called it the Code of a Man of Honor. He says he had refused to look upon a virgin or violate a covenant with his wife. He had rejected falsehood. He had heeded the concerns of his workers. He had cared for the poor. He had cared for the orphan and the widow and the cold. He had not trusted in his wealth. He had not practiced idolatry. He had never celebrated the downfall of his enemies. He had always offered hospitality. He had not hidden secret sins. He had not mistreated his land or his people. The entire weight of Job's community's rejection has fallen on him. Everybody wants him to concede that he was not a good or person of integrity, because that is the only possible explanation for his suffering from their point of view. And despite all the pressure, scorn, and maybe even threat, Job has refused to give his community this interpretation. And so he stands alone. Now I'm going to make a turn to post-evangelicals and see if we can draw some parallels. And maybe not all of you would call yourself post-evangelicals. That is, people who were somewhere at some point in the evangelical community and are now on the other side. But let's say some of you are. So let's try some parallels. Maybe, first, like the character Job, you were raised in a certain airtight theological system. It might have included something like just world theology, but it also included lots of other doctrines and beliefs. Everyone in the community was supposed to believe all these things. Sound familiar? There was a time when maybe you believed them all. It was kind of nice being part of a faith community where everyone believed the same stuff and the world made sense in an airtight system. But secondly, maybe, like with Job, something happened to you or to others or in your life that made you begin questioning the system. Maybe it was deep and personal, like you or your sibling turned out to be LGBTQ, or your sister died of cancer, or your pastor got away with abusing teenagers. Whatever it was, you entered a painful faith crisis because you could no longer accept the old theology, ethic, and the happy, clappy, complacent community that was once your home. Any familiar bells ringing? Okay. Third, and then maybe like Job, you began raising questions. Hey, but what about, I gotta ask you about, and when you did, your faith community became very uneasy and reiterated its old theology back to you. Right? They warned you not to raise such questions, so such questions are from the devil. If, nevertheless, you persisted, they responded by pushing you to the margins or out of the community because you were now a threat to piety and virtue. Fourth, then maybe like Job, you might have been tempted to go along to get along. After all, it's not a small deal to lose a theology and a church and your best friends and maybe good relations with your family all in one blow. Carrots and sticks of every kind were probably deployed to get you to cooperate. Perhaps there were moments where you yourself had trouble understanding why you were so alone in seeing things differently from those around you. Maybe you were the one who was wrong. I can't tell you how many times people come to me and said, I think I may be going crazy because I don't see things the way that they all do, and what's wrong with me? This is kind of crazy making. But maybe finally, like Job, you came through to the other side of that. And in the end, you held on to what you now know to be true and are clear about what you now know to not be true. You, despite the pressure, refuse to accept the old theological and moral beliefs that you once believed, and that your old community still demands of you if you are to be on good terms with them. So now you're on the other side of that. If I'm saying I think there are some parallels here with Job. And by the way, this whole process involves a considerable amount of suffering. Losing theology, losing community, losing family, losing certainty, losing acceptance, having all kinds of questions, it's hard. Let me close by saying, what about God and where is God in all of this? Scholars debate what to make of the end of the book of Job. You'll remember that after chapter and chapter of Job complaining, and chapter of Job's friends saying, "Stop complaining," God shows up, answering Job out of the whirlwind. But what kind of answer is it? It's 4 chapters of the Nature Channel. In 2 rounds of challenge, God essentially says, "I'm going to take you on a tour around the most mysterious and wild dimensions of the creation that I made, and I'm going to say, who are you to question me?" Job's answer to all of this is very debated. It looks to me like it amounts to him being fairly overwhelmed, aware of his smallness, aware of God's power, grateful that God has finally answered him after 38 chapters, and ready to be very quiet for a long time. Whether he is really repentant for his challenge is debated. The Hebrew of Job 42:6 is a matter of interpretation. In the end, that little postscript affirms his virtue, doesn't blame him for questioning, blames the friends, and he gets everything back double, including twice as many kids, and they're all beautiful, right? Few readers are terribly satisfied by the ending of the book. Yet this is how it ends, and we've had the joy of arguing about it for 2,400 years. So what about us? Some of us remain in what might be described as a place of theological mystery or groping in the dark. We know what we do not believe anymore. We may be less sure of what we do believe. We might seek encounter with God still. We pray, we meditate, we ask God to speak to us. But we remember how encounter with God used to be understood and sometimes manufactured back in the old world. You know those moments at retreats and so on where you had a manufactured experience of God right on schedule, right? Maybe we're no longer exactly sure what a true encounter with God looks like, but we would like to have one. We might be able to identify, like Job, with feeling small and overwhelmed and having more questions than answers. The book of Job ends with Job returning to his life. It has some elements that are old, mainly it's all new. One imagines he's not likely to ever attempt such an epic questioning of God again. One hopes he never needs to. Has Job learned anything? Have we learned anything from our own journeys? I think so. Job has learned that just world theology doesn't really work. He has learned that once he was a pretty complacent rich man whose complacent theology was deeply affected by his place at the top of society. He's been brought low, and having been brought low, he has learned that the world has much more persistent and terrible injustice than he ever noticed before. He has learned to see the world from the perspective of the laborer and the enslaved, the cold and the hungry, the people who sit on the ash heaps in our world, the wounded, the dying. He has been forced to acknowledge that evil ones often do live long, exalted, secure lives while innocent ones suffer. I think that this new Job understands that God is more wild and mysterious than the system permitted understanding of before. But having suffered a lot, I am hopeful that he is now prepared to extend what had been the ethic of benevolence of a privileged person to a more radical ethic of solidarity with the oppressed, with those who live in the shadows and the cold, those who are abandoned. Look at Job 24. He's come to notice the suffering of the world. One place where I identify with Job is when I was evangelical ethicist who gets invited to speak everywhere, there's a certain kind of privilege, honor, power, and status that goes with that. When all of that was taken away, it was not fun. But I began to notice people that I had never noticed before. That is, all those people who the system had said, you're not okay. If you're going to be a part here in this church, you will be on the margins. In other words, something about being brought low is good for us. Nobody ever wants it to happen. I think Job defended his integrity, and he had integrity of a sort. It was the integrity of the person who meets his obligations from atop the system of power. But this new Job, on the other side, is seeing things in some more holistic ways. He's seeing the people who live at the bottom. and he's identifying with them, and he will never not notice them again. So my charge to you, church, is to be okay with mystery and uncertainty in theology, but to know what you know and to not let anybody tell you that you've gone crazy or you've lost your bearings. One of the things that I hope you know is that a life of following Jesus is a life of radical solidarity with those who suffer in the shadows and in the cold and those who are the abandoned of this earth. And that you will stand in solidarity with them and that will never change. There's no going back to the old complacencies, the kind of happy suburban faith where it all makes sense because we're pretty privileged people and we got all our systems worked out. That's over. On the other side, there's only going forward into greater and more inclusive love and justice alongside our suffering neighbors. So Job defended his integrity. God taught him some new things. Maybe we've been taught some new things too.